All right, I think that means that everybody is connected and here. Hopefully everybody can hear me clearly. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you may be calling from on this planet or anywhere in the galaxy. Thank you so much for joining us. What is not so early for me, but might be bright and early for many of you. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to chat with you today and to be part of your program. My name is Rania El Mugammar. I work as an artist, a social justice educator, and consultant, and I work in 4 areas that are all going to sort of weave their way into the conversation today, because conversations about justice, power, and anti-oppression are really conversations that are about every facet and every aspect of our lives, and including and not limited to our place in the world as artists. So the first part of my portfolio is I work in arts and culture. I think about what are the spaces in which we define what culture is, and how do we come to those spaces, and who gets access to them, and what is it that we make in these spaces. Secondly, I work in a field called digital justice, which is the intersection of social justice and technology. Primarily, I look at how people program their own biases into technology. I also look at digital identity, digital security, and digital access, as well as techno-solutionism for policing technologies. Basically, I look at predictive policing technologies. I look at technologies that are supposed to help apprehend people, whether that be ShotSpotter, which helps to locate supposedly where a gunshot is fired, whether it is an AI that does facial recognition, whether it is a breathalyzer that is meant to detect more than the presence of alcohol in your bloodstream, so on and so forth. So the intersection of technology and policing, mostly when in digital justice, reproductive justice, and abolition slash transformative justice, which means I help people see the possibility in a world without police or prisons. What I'm really excited to talk to you about here today is sort of this big introductory conversation to social justice, and particularly the way that it relates to our practice in the world as artists, as cultural producers, as people in or adjacent to those spaces. So I'll invite you to please send me any questions that you're having in the chat. I probably will leave the last 15 to 20 minutes for questions, but feel free to ask them when they come up, and I'll keep track of them. Feel free to, say, I don't understand that, and I'll stop and clarify rather than wait towards the end if it's a clarifying question. So one of the things that I think is important to begin this conversation by doing is a framing from where I speak right now. Every chance I get the opportunity to challenge this sort of big story that Canada tells about itself, I'm calling in from Toronto, colonially known as Toronto here in Canada. And Canada is one of these places with really good PR. It's got a good branding out there in the world. It's seen as this peaceful, picturesque, multicultural haven, this welcoming place, this extremely diverse place. And this place that was possible because of this idea of terra nullius, or the empty land, which is the story that Canada tells about itself most often. It says, we came here to Turtle Island and the land was empty, even though it's been the site of human activity for more than 100,000 years by many thousands of indigenous nations. And, we made this haven, this beautiful place where nothing bad ever happens. And one of the ways that Canada does this is by telling its story against the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin being the United States. So Canada has this idea that there is no racial discrimination in Canada because we don't have a history of slavery. Not true. Canada had enslavement for more than 200 years, enslavement of both Black and Indigenous people, or this idea that Canada treats everybody equally. But the reality is Canada does a terrible job of collecting data about people's experiences as they relate to who they are. And when we do have that data, we find that we're actually often worse than the United States in terms of gender gaps, racial gaps, in terms of classism, so on and so forth. But I'll dive into that stuff a bit more as the conversation unfolds. So for me, it's really important. I think I feel a great sense of responsibility as someone who is not an Indigenous person in this context, but who has settled here in so-called Canada, but on Turtle Island, as it is referred to in many Indigenous creation stories. But I benefit from it. It grants me some level of safety. And at the same time, I have this tension or this conflict with it. I came here to Toronto by way of the Valley of the Nile in Sudan, which is also a former British colony. So for me, and probably for a lot of people on this call right now, colonialism is not this distant, abstract thing that happens to other people. It's not a page in someone else's history textbook. There's profound ramifications for myself and my family, both those of us who are still so-called back home, as we immigrants often have our mental bags packed forever, and then those of us who are in the diaspora as well. It's had a profound impact on us. So it's really important to name that. And it's important to name that because Canada tells this story so well that it not only erases that Indigenous people were here when settlers arrived, but also that Indigenous people continue to be here right now. In Toronto, which is an Indigenous word meaning where the trees are standing tall in the water. Because when you go to the shoreline of Toronto, there are lots of trees that are planted firmly in the water. And this place is governed by many Indigenous ways of knowing and being, but we are currently, or I am currently calling in from the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, the Métis, the Petun, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And I'm governed by the Wampum One Dish with One Spoon Treaty Belt, which is meant to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. This part of the statement that I just said is called the land acknowledgement or a territorial acknowledgement. And it is common practice in many places that are currently colonized and where Indigenous people continue to live, love, and work. And it's really important because it helps to challenge that singular, narrow understanding of history and allows us to come face to face with the systems of power, the structures, and the contemporary realities that are made possible by that history, and the ongoing projects that it enforces, including colonialism. So I'm gonna stop here with the land acknowledgement, but I really do invite you to deep dive into this practice and to engage with it. It's really, I think, fundamental for our future together if we're gonna have any kind of justice in the world. I already introduced myself, but the reason that's there is so that you can have my contact information later on, because I'll share this presentation with the folks organizing this lovely here digital gathering. So I'm gonna start with some big picture stuff. One of the first things that I'd like you to pivot towards right now, okay, is take a nice big deep breath and remember that every system, every structure, every power dynamic in the world was made up by somebody. Somebody dreamt all of this shit up. We're literally living inside of the imagination of a very small group of people. With that understanding, this idea of anti-oppression, anti-racism, and social justice says, hey, if somebody dreamt it up, then it isn't really natural, it isn't really inevitable, and it's certainly not our only option. If we look at that dream of the world the way that it's currently structured, it's a little pyramid, a pyramid that shares over 500 plus years of history that have made its sides the way that they are, its power structures the way that they are, its influences the way that they are. In this pyramid, you can see that you have my terrible handwriting on all sides, but on the side here where you see it says political context. In the political context of the pyramid, it shapes really who has access to political power, who gets to make decisions, right? Who gets to be part of the design of our political systems and our political discourse. And that shapes more than just whether we are a democracy or not, right? It's not that binary, but it shapes even within the context of something that is democratic. Who has access to political power, political representation, political will, and political influence. Down at the bottom, we have the economic context, right? The economic context shapes who has access to resources and how they access those resources. It shapes our economic systems, how we trade, what we value. It's often built on the exploitation of labor, land, and resources. The exploitation of land and labor and resources come hand in hand in the project of colonialism, which has really shaped the world that we live in today. Because it says, first, land is something that is to be owned, and if somebody's not making use of that land, aka extracting the most resources from it at all times, whether or not it destroys the environment or the system or the climate or the land itself and renders it uninhabitable for generations to come, that is the fundamental use of land. But it also shapes who owns land intergenerationally. Land ownership is one of the most fundamentally economic defining experiences of somebody's life and of families intergenerationally. Passing down land is one of the ways that people are able to accumulate wealth and break out of the so-called cycle of poverty. And how people are invited into the center or into positions of privilege is often vis-a-vis land ownership. So you can start to see systematic disenfranchisement or lack of access to land for communities that are marginalized in varying contexts, right? So if you were to look in the context of Sri Lanka, for example, you would find that land ownership is predominantly Sinhalese, which is the ethnic majority, right? Whereas if you look at Tamil communities who are historically oppressed and have experienced genocide, you will find that they are disproportionately disenfranchised when it comes to land ownership. In the context of Canada, you will see that land ownership is systematically exclude Black and Indigenous communities. If you look at a global context, you start to see not only the color lines, but the gender lines. And you start to see that right now, less than 15% of all property across the globe is in the hands of women. So we can start to see the gender of poverty. We can see that poverty is predominantly a gendered experience. So in this economic context, the consequences are profound for people because we live in a capitalist world where it says if you don't have access to money, to resources, or to land, then your worth or your participation in the system isn't accounted for, except for to steal your labor, right? We learned something during this pandemic, which is that all wealth comes from people's labor. When the world stopped, we began to face the economic consequences, right? So if there are no people at the very bottom of the pyramid, lots of people working to send resources all the way to the top of the pyramid doesn't exist, right? So the most people are doing the most work at the bottom and resources flow upwards in the pyramid. So on this side of the pyramid, we have the side that is probably most relevant to us, who are artists, who are musicians, who are cultural producers, which is the cultural context. The cultural context of the system says that through a series of choices over the last 500 years made by less than 1% of the people who use the world today, we've defined a cultural order, right? Meaning a cultural supremacy, meaning there's an order for which we see what cultures, what cultural production, what art, what histories, what ways of knowing and being are valued and which ones are devalued. So in the context of the cultural order, it sort of sells this idea that Western development is the natural, inevitable course of the entire world. That everybody in the world, if they were left to their own devices, would be heading quickly, radically towards that trajectory of becoming more like Western countries, regardless of the fact that if you looked empirically at the amount of resources in the world, you would realize that sort of rapid industrialization is just not sustainable and not feasible. But it does sell this idea that cultures eventually will get to be like Western ones, given enough time to become civilized or to develop. And in this cultural supremacy, then it says, if there is cultural supremacy, then there is a clear and defining line that says what is good or fine art, right? In the cultural order, it says some art is just better than others because it's more real art. In the context of music, we can see that in what we program, who we program. We can see that in what sort of artists and what sort of work rises to the top. We can even see that in our frames of reference when we say classical. Classical for whom? Right, when we distinguish between classical and folk, when we distinguish between craft and, excuse me, fine art, there's often gender, race, class, and cultural dynamics that are playing into that. So in the context of the cultural order, there's a sense that in the world of art, there's a sifter, right? And this sifter, through critical consensus and merit and hard work, brings what is objectively the best artwork to the top. Objectively. Objectively is a good thing to stop for a minute and chew on. This idea of objectivity is part of the ways that the pyramid is able to stay intact, right? It paints a position named neutral. And from the position of named neutral, you can decide what is the best culture, what is the best art. You can decide from the position of neutral what are the best political systems and what's good for everybody else. You can decide from the position of neutral to make economic decisions that have profound intergenerational consequences for families and then call it neutral. The reality is there is no such thing as neutral. Everybody in the pyramid is speaking from a location. Objectivity is a myth that is often tied to privilege. It's one of those things we need to start challenging. In order to begin looking at this idea of social justice or this idea of liberation as something that is feasible, something that we can achieve, I asked you first to pivot, right? Which is to take that deep breath, to turn a bit to the side and to face this realization that, oh my God, somebody dreamt all this nonsense up. The second pivot that I'm going to ask you to do that will hopefully expand your view even more is challenging this idea of objectivity and challenging this idea of inevitability. It is inevitable the world will be this way. It is inevitable that people will harm one another. It is inevitable that there will be injustice, there will be scarcity, that nobody will have, that we don't have enough, that somebody will be left out. This idea keeps us sort of complacent. If there isn't enough for everybody, it's another one of the things we need to challenge, the myth of scarcity. If there isn't enough for everybody, then it makes sense to fight each other to survive, right? It makes sense to sit here and to complain that, oh my God, you know, people are getting $2,000 a month, free money from the government to get through COVID. This is what's happening here in Canada. There's the COVID emergency relief benefit, which is giving some people, not everybody, $2,000 a month to help them get through the financial realities of the pandemic. Now, a lot of people are upset by this. $2,000 a month for free, right? People will be lazy, people will not work. Every study that has been done on universal basic income found that when people's basic needs are taken care of, they dedicate their energy to radically transforming their communities and making them more inclusive. But it leaves you focused because of scarcities. Oh, that $2,000 is taken from me. That's how we think about it. And I'm like, that's what we're doing. Meanwhile, like 2 weeks ago on a Monday, Jeff Bezos makes $13 billion fucking dollars, okay? $13 billion. Nobody makes $13 billion a day or in a lifetime. You can only take $13 billion in a day or in a lifetime. $13 billion worth of other people's labor. $13 billion, I sat there and I did the mental math, is $9.7222 million a minute. $9.7222 million a minute, which is roughly $9.69 million more than the average full-time Amazon employee makes per year. That is the labor of those people that produces that. That's capitalism. So it leaves you focused, because of scarcity, focused on the wrong place. We're literally looking at the person who's barely getting by on $2,000 a month while Jeff Bezos is right over here like the eye of fucking Sauron. Okay, that's the reality of it, is that the scarcity keeps you fighting each other. One of the easiest things to see in the pyramid is looking up. It's hard to look down. It's easy to see the people who have power over you, harder to see the ways in which you might have relative power over people. Relative. That's a good word to chew on too. You can see here closer to the top of the pyramid, there is a dot and it says relative privilege. It means that through the lottery of birth, through no choice of their own, but genuinely what body you are born in, who you are born to, what context you are born within, what you have access to, the lottery of birth. You may be born in a position of relative privilege with more access to resources, opportunities, and choices. Through the lottery of birth, you might also be born closer to the bottom of the pyramid with less access to resources, opportunities, and choices, more exposure to harm. And it takes no intention on the part of either person, neither that person closer to the top, nor the person closer to the bottom of the pyramid, to make the other's life a reality. But they're connected because they're part of the same system. Nothing happens in the space outside of the pyramid. Everything happens in the pyramid. Everything. So if everything happens in the pyramid, that means something else happens in the pyramid, which is the practice of art making, music making, creativity, cultural production happens inside the pyramid, right? Which often leads to cultural imperialism. Cultural imperialism, which says there is one singular way of doing things. One singular way of approaching anything, whether that is music, whether it's what we think of as like our training models, right? Says that that's the only way to do it. That's the only way. And it should be enforced on everybody. Cultural imperialism also looks like US supremacy in the world and the way in which American culture is exported and often enforced on people for whom it makes no sense. Cultural imperialism continues in colonized places against indigenous people to get them to assimilate. And then the contentious sister of cultural supremacy and cultural imperialism, which is cultural appropriation. Cultural appropriation is one of those conversations that in music spaces we could get into for all of eternity. And it's almost always the most well-attended sort of conversation that I host in those spaces, because it's an area where we have influence and control and potentially some challenges. Cultural appropriation is where you belong to a dominant culture that has historically oppressed a marginalized culture. And then you take from that culture, from the marginalized culture, without permission. You strip something of its context. You often repackage it and monetize it, or even get credit for it. Cultural appropriation happens within the context of injustice and also within the context of cultural genocide, often after devaluing that culture and saying that, it doesn't matter, it doesn't count, it's not really XYZ, until you are like, you know what, hold up, that's cute, actually. We see this with everything from music to fashion to food to medicine. For a long time, alternative, plant-based, or herbal medicines, Chinese medicine, were considered by Western scientific communities and largely in Western public discourse as these things that, they're not really valid. They're gross, they're weird, they don't do anything. They're not real science. Meanwhile, I'm like, China is like more than 5,000 years old. You think they might have figured some medical stuff out? You really think if something hasn't worked for 5,000 years, it would continue to be used? But this idea that from our position, we can judge what is real science, what is real music, what is real art, what's real culture, what's good fashion, what's good food, as this is neutral, objective, universal standard. Again, those things coming hand in hand to work with one another. Objectivity, scarcity, inevitability, culture, politics, money. Everything is married together. Okay, so I'm going to show you a picture I hate, and I also like it a little. So every time I put this picture up, I know folks from the International Contemporary Ensemble are probably sick of me showing this picture simultaneously complaining about it. But this picture is helpful to me because it helps us see this third panel of liberation as something we can visualize. I still think it's problematic, but we're always using imperfect tools to try and dream up something we haven't built before. So here we go. So in the first panel there, you see 3 people standing on boxes and it says equality. You can see there's a fence, and in the model of equality, it's based on this idea that everybody gets a box to stand on. Everybody gets the same thing. So everybody gets the box, and the person in the blue didn't even need one and is probably arguably further advantaged by having one. The person in the purple got the box, but it really didn't do shit for them. They're still looking at the same barrier. The person in the red got the box and is able to see over the fence, but not because anybody looked at them and said, hey, red shirt, what is it that you need to get past this barrier that you have in your life? What is it that you need for us to offset this system that is blocking you out? This just worked because it happened to be the right size by sheer coincidence and foolish luck. Then we have equity in the next panel over. Now, equity makes sense to me. It's the work of harm reduction. It says, can't wait for a perfect world, so you need to help people get past the barriers now. So equity says, give everyone what they need. Right? That makes sense. Give everybody as many boxes as they need to see over the fence, which means I go to purple shirt, red shirt, and blue shirt and say, what do you need to see over the fence? Keep in mind, I'm still only presenting them with the choice to see over the fence. It's still limited. It's only mitigating the barrier. So inside this space of equity, everybody got as many boxes as they need to see over the fence, and we use the same number of boxes as we did in equality, but because resources were distributed equitably rather than equally, we were able to impact people far more profoundly, right? And then finally, we have the last panel here, liberation. Anti-racism, anti-oppression is trying to get us to liberation. Liberation says, yes, you can give people boxes to see over the fence, but you should probably bring the fence down. Now, liberation and equity are not mutually exclusive. You can see there's not a hard line between the two panels, the way that there is between equality and equity. We actually do both simultaneously. Sometimes it's quicker to get some soapboxes and get people to see over the fence while we work at the same time towards bringing the fence down. So equality is this nonsense that says give everyone what they need. That doesn't take into account where people are starting from, their capacities, what barriers exactly they face, their unique context. And then we have equity, which says give everyone what they need, which takes into account people's needs in order to offset existing systemic barriers. And then we have liberation, which says, yeah, just bring the fence down. Okay? So anti-racism, anti-oppression, and the work of social justice is trying to get us to get to liberation. And one of the most extraordinary, freeing, and radical things we can do in resistance to injustice, to systemic barriers, to that violent history in the pyramid and the contemporary pain that it causes almost all of us, is to take back our imagination. We have to. Our imagination is being captured by this either or. It's either this or it's that, by these limited options that are placed in front of us, by the idea of inevitability, scarcity, by the binary of either or thinking. So as we are taking back our imagination, it asks you spend a lot of time dreaming up liberation so you may recognize it when you get to it, right? Spend a lot of time really imagining what a world without barriers looks like. Somebody imagined all of this. What might you imagine that looks different? What might you imagine that you would build that would serve you and somebody not even like you, right? What are the tools that you might need to do that? One of the things that is offered to us through the work of anti-racism and anti-oppression is this idea of intersectionality. Ooh, I skipped it. I'll come back to one of those slides in a minute. But is this idea of intersectionality. So intersectionality is probably one of the single most misunderstood social justice concepts, right? It is not a theory, please. If you take anything from my talk today, which is what I beg everybody in every presentation I give, is that intersectionality isn't a theory. First, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the Black intellectual labor that went into understanding intersectionality. Intersectionality is first articulated by the Combahee River Collective in a series of writings called This Bridge Called My Back, and then by a Black feminist by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term intersectionality and brought it into academia. Kimberly Crenshaw we're lucky to have her with us in the world today. She does a number of really amazing and extraordinary things including run a podcast called Intersectionality Matters. I'm going to share with you a link to one of the episodes that I think is really lovely, called Narrating the Nightmare and Reimagining the Possible. And it is about sort of our present moment in the cradle of these intersecting pandemics. And one of the best things that she does is invite Arundhati Roy, the author, to talk about this idea of the pandemic as a portal. So I've just dropped the link to it in the chat, that I think it's worthy of listening to, and they're updating it with a transcript in case that makes it more accessible to you. So intersectionality first is an embodied reality, which means that you and your body, me and my body, I'm an intersectional person, right? I have a multitude of identities. I'm not defined by any single one of them, but I am defined by the collectiveness of all of those identities together. I'm not a pie chart. I don't get to experience my womanhood, my blackness, my Muslimness, my queerness, all in different segments. I experience those things simultaneously. They create my unique lived experience. What this tells me is that I'm also the site of many identities that might privilege me in the world, many identities and experiences that being the world is designed for me, and many identities and experiences that marginalize me in the world. And that both of those things are possible at the same time. You're not either privileged or you're not. Intersectionality tells us that we are more than the sum of our parts, that all our oppressions are interlinked, they amplify and inform each other, that all our privileges are interlinked, they amplify and inform each other, that intersectionality really invites us to do the self-reflection piece and ask you, what is a world that you can come to with all of your parts look like? How often do we turn off a part of our experience or hide a part of our identity or fail to really contend with it because the world isn't really designed to be able to take that up? Intersectionality is also a systemic reality. It says that systems of power and privilege share a history. They work in collusion with each other, right? That the prison industrial complex or the criminal justice system intersects with education, intersects with healthcare, right? That all power dynamics in the world share a history, a future, and a present reality. It tells us that also intersectionality invites us to understand that there's not a singular experience of any one identity. So therefore, even in communities that are marginalized, there are power dynamics, right? That if I were to stand up right now and start listing off the names of Black people who have died at the hands of state-sanctioned violence in the United States, you might recognize most of the men, but probably one or two or maybe even none of the women. That it tells us even though police violence and state-sanctioned violence is a reality in all of Black people's lives, for Black women it is a reality that is often unacknowledged because we live at the intersection not only of Blackness in an anti-Black world, but of womanhood in a misogynist world. Intersectionality is also really important because it's a practice, it's a thing you do. As a practice, intersectionality is a design tool. It says, take the most marginalized person and design backwards. Everyone else will be included by default. Don't design for the top of the pyramid and wonder why nothing reaches the bottom ever. Right? Design from the bottom up. Put the most marginalized at the center of your designs and allow that to inform the work that you do. Intersectionality is, to me, perhaps the thing that has been the best at articulating all of the complex places, spaces, and experiences that I've had, growing up in a lot of, I grew up in 4 continents. Is it 4? Yeah, 4 continents. So my experiences are pretty international. My idea of culture is complicated, but at the same time, I recognize that intersectionality is the one thing that allows me to come and bring all of that with me and to feel whole in all of it and not to look at it in these fragmented ways. So I have said a lot in the last 30 minutes. I tried to slow down. I actually have a little app here that's counting how many words a minute I'm saying because I'm trying to learn to slow down for interpreters of sign language, because I always work with them in my own sessions, my public sessions and my solo sessions. So I'm trying to learn to slow down for accessibility. And I speak, when I'm really excited, about 200 words a minute. And nobody processes information that fast. So I have to learn to slow it down. So while I take my breath, I'm going to ask you to, if you have any questions, reflections, or thoughts, and to share those thoughts, questions, or reflections in whatever ways make sense for you. Sorry about the extreme zoom in. That's not intentional. Any thoughts, reflections, questions, input, disagreements, jokes? If they come to you, feel free to drop them in the chat. Um, Most definitely. Thank you for that question, Raphael. Raphael sent a question. They're asking about providing the resource that we can look up the Indigenous land that we're on. So most definitely I can send that in the follow-up materials. There's a number of tools and there's a number of maps that I can send to you, particularly if you are in the so-called Americas, or if you are in Australia or New Zealand. Any other thoughts, questions, or reflections? Thank you, Willie. Ooh, that's a good question. Marissa, how can art play a new positive role in post-policing society, considering new community efforts taking place? Here's the thing, right? So art, I think, does an extraordinary thing of taking something so big, like the idea of police abolition or prison abolition, and makes it seem completely rational, right? So one of the ways that I do this is through, I'm a theater artist and a writer, right? And one of the things that you have to do in theater school that I hated so much is improv. But I realized through improvisation that I am funny, like I'm hilarious, right? And humor is one of those things, and creativity is one of those things that can take something that is like, feels academic and theoretical, and makes you realize, oh crap, I actually think I already believe in this, right? So I'm gonna come to somebody in my, one of my friends hosts this play, and the premise of the play is that somebody gets pulled over. That's how it starts. So then I stop her, I stopped the whole play, and I said, why are you calling the police? And she said, what? No, that's the play. And the police are here. And I was like, well, you know, somebody called the police. And if you call the police, they're going to show up late with a notepad, and I can do that for you. You know, and she laughed. And I was like, seriously, who do you want to show up 2 hours late with a notepad? Have the cops ever returned anything that was stolen of yours when you called them? She says, no, right? And then we imagine that. We say, okay, what does policing look like? And then look at history. Like history is such an extraordinary and remarkable teacher. Why? Because in art, we get to bring that archive forward and learn about it. So we learn from folk songs what were the punishments for people in the past. We learn from folk songs in our traditional context, or in Sudan, how people have handled some of the biggest conflicts in our collective history. Right? So art is also really profound because art is inherently transformative. Art doesn't try to punish people. It doesn't serve that function. Yeah, you might listen to a sad song, you make sure it can do as much damage as possible, but the reality is art is inherently transformative. It is able to take a feeling and make it into a thing. And I think that's a mindset that helps us move towards that idea of abolition. Art is also remarkable because it's able to make us contend with something right in front of our eyes. right in front of our eyes. That is perhaps very difficult to see. Art does an incredible job of making the invisible visible. So that's an incredible question. I strongly recommend, if you have the time, Marissa, that you come. I think we're hosting in September, called Art Making as a Fundamentally Abolitionist Practice. And I'll send the link to everybody afterwards. Hopefully somebody can come. It's a teach-in. I'm not the only speaker. I'm just catching up on some of the questions. How can artists support new understandings of history, more inclusive ones? Which ways have you seen that are exciting and inspiring? Thank you, Lorena, for that question. I actually saw a really remarkable play recently by an Indigenous person, where they were, the first thing that they did was they made everybody get up and they made everybody sign a treaty. So they literally had said, this is how we will be with each other in this space, get up and sign a treaty. And it's remarkable because for most people who are living on colonized land, you're technically a treaty signatory because you're a citizen and the crown is the signatory, right? So she's like, well, what sort of responsibility do you feel when you get up and physically sign something versus when you know your ancestors or the crown has signed it on your behalf and then you're a citizen and you feel sort of distantly responsible from it? How does that even change the air? So I think it's really remarkable that it helps us take responsibility for history like that. But also art is the remarkable space of what my partner calls speculative reclamation. I don't know if I can pick up the sculpture. I'm gonna try to pick up a sculpture and show you something. Oh, it is heavy, okay. So my partner makes these works. They're Lego sculptures. This is a tiny one, but he's made massive, huge life-sized unicorns and massive 100,000 piece owls and things like that. So he's a sculptor who works predominantly with Black Lego, and his work focuses on this idea of speculative reclamation. So how do you take a history that's been told from a certain vantage point and give yourself creative license to retell that? So that is like a sort of reimagining of one of my ancestors, Kendake Aminaranes, the warrior queen, who is infamously known for pushing out the forces of Augustus from Egypt. And it is this sort of a story of not only of resistance, of reclamation, of the power of women warriors, of decolonizing, and then a story of being petty. And it's a funny story because when Kendaka finally defeats Augustus and she kicks him out of Sudan and southern Egypt, she buries the head of one of his statues at the foot of her palace so everybody can tread on the head of her enemy. And when she dies, she has him buried beneath her foot. And so stories of Black resistance to even earlier attempts at conquest in Africa are often quite disappeared. So how do we then begin to excavate that and use art to tell it in a new way? That somebody is not going to contend with this, reading about it in a annotated Kushite history textbook, right? But contending with a Lego sculpture that is what is going on here? It's an entirely different space. So I think art is the opportunity. Art is the tantalizing and often seductive invitation to do that. I think artists also have the opportunity and the responsibility to educate our audiences and to not think of the work that we're doing as just that we owe our audience a product, right? That's how our audiences have been conditioned. So I think it's interesting to start poking that quite a bit and to start unraveling it and to start to look at really what does it look like to be an artist in a world that also encompasses your full life and doesn't just want you to make things. Are we allowed that, right? The life of the artist and not just the art itself. So that's basically what I'm turning over here. Some examples of cultural appropriation and why they are in that category. Most definitely, I would encourage you to look up a piece called Slav, which was a piece that was programmed to be part of the Montreal Jazz Festival. If people are not familiar with this drama, you ought to be. So this piece, which was programmed to be part of the Montreal Jazz Festival, was a compilation of the songs of enslaved people, arranged entirely by white people, performed entirely by white people. And so everybody was like, we're not doing this. And they're like, why? Freedom of expression. I was like, are you serious? This isn't even about just music that was made by a Black person. This speaks specifically to an experience for which there is recorded, understood, scientific, spiritual, historical, emotional, psychological evidence of intergenerational trauma. It is continues to be one of the singular most defining experiences for Black people the world over. Not only Black people who are descendants of enslaved people here in the Americas, but Black people who immigrate and then pass psychologically, spiritually through the Middle Passage, aka the space where their Blackness is now defined against a history of whiteness and a history of enslavement, which perhaps in our original context, it's defined against other things, right? So in that space, appropriating that resistance, appropriating that history, it isn't yours to share, right? Not only is it not yours to share, it's not yours to make money off of. It's not yours to sell tickets to. It's not yours to decide how to arrange it or how to contextualize it. Especially because in the context of a festival that has done a pretty good job excluding a lot of Black people, considering it's a decidedly Black genre, like a lot of music is. So when we start to look at cultural appropriation, there's often spiritual, psychological, or emotional harm, stripping something of its cultural context, and then somebody getting paid, and the wrong somebody getting paid, right? Not the person who actually owns that cultural production. And especially in a world that says there's this big a space for Black music makers to make music, you can't go and take one of the tiny, minute sections of that space. So I know that we're probably like a minute away from finishing, just out of time. I will send, Tyler, I see your question. I'll send some suggestions for artists that are thinking about these practices. There's a lot of really remarkable people who are thinking about an anti-racist and anti-oppressive lens through which they do their work. So I'll send a little follow-up to folks on the organizing end, and we'll connect that way. In the meantime, I invite you to connect with me. The best way to do this, honestly, is on social media. If you're on Instagram, that's currently the only social media outlet that I'm checking because I'm a little overwhelmed. So I'm dropping my Instagram handle here. Please feel free to connect with me. I do AMAs, so you missed today's AMA, but I do these Ask Me Anythings live in the morning on Mondays. So please feel free to send any questions that you have there or email me. So thank you all so much for having me today.